Welcome back. In our last lecture, we started to talk about the genre of fiction and how important voice is. A cleverly constructed voice can tell you something about the characters of a story or the author of a magazine article. Is the speaker male or female? A modern person or one living in 19th century England? Educated? Angry? Genteel? All of these things can be conveyed by voice. And sometimes with just a very few words or the simple rearrangement of the order of words or clauses in a sentence, you can really give your readers a feeling for the voice. In the exercises that accompanied Lecture 4, I gave you some pieces of information and asked you to try and rewrite the information as if it was being given by a variety of different people: children, parents, teenagers, a member of Congress. If you didn't have a chance to get to the exercises, that's just fine. You still get my point, that different people would use different voices to convey the same kind of information. The goal, of course, was to get you to think about how you might construct the voice of the author to create the impression of a particular character who is doing the talking or describing. Today, we're going to discuss the other side of that coin, so to speak. And the other side of that coin is the importance of knowing your reader and how to identify and, in fact, construct an audience. So while the exercises for the last lecture focused on how to create an authorial or writerly persona, you'll see that the exercises for today will focus on how to identify, respect, and in fact, create a particular kind of audience. I've stressed this point several times so far in this lecture series, but it bears repeating. One of the most important factors in terms of what makes a piece of writing good is the writer's understanding of the nature of his or her audience. Perhaps even more important is understanding what particular information you need or want to convey to your audience. In other words, if we break it down into a nutshell, you have to know what you want to say, how you want to say it, and why you want to say it. Writing without a clear idea of these factors is just fine for a first draft. And in fact, drafting without a clear idea as to what it is you really want to say is an excellent way to figure out what it is that you want to say. And this kind of drafting, writing your way to an argument or an argumentative position, is something we're going to talk about at length in a later lecture. But if you're writing anything from a magazine article to a short story to a letter to the editor to an essay for a class, you need to really have a focus to guide you. And this focus needs to include how you want to construct your voice, as we discussed last time, and also how you want to cater to and define your audience. And that's what we're going to address today. We're going to start by analyzing some pieces of writing, working through them, as it were, to try and figure out the intended audience. We'll try to figure out how the writers construct an audience and how they convey respect for that audience, or in some cases, fail to respect those audiences, and what the consequences of that failure might be. Let's consider the opening of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Black Cat. Now, this story belongs to what we call a subgenre of fiction writing that's referred to as detective or gothic writing. And you can tell from the very first word the way in which the author is, first of all, creating a really clear, specific voice for his narrator, and secondly, how he's constructing an imagined audience. Here's how the story opens. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. Okay, so after our last lecture, you've probably got lots of thoughts about construction of the voice of the speaker here. There are some sort of emphatic, kind of disjointed utterances. his admission that this wild tale is incredible even to himself, and then he protests that he's not mad, and he does this at least twice. Well, I imagine that all of this might make you think, okay, what we've got here is a crazy person. So you probably had no problem nailing down this first issue of voice that we've just identified. But now let's consider the other side of the equation and talk about how this, in fact, makes an audience. What's the first thing you think of when you try to imagine the audience that Poe creates for his work? Well, first off, we need to remember that just like a text can have multiple lives when we read, reread, and think about it, a text can have multiple audiences. One could be as much a fictional construction as the character himself, and that would seem to be the case here. Poe is writing the story so that it's about a madman describing something to an unknown individual. And the syntax and the structure here creates the fiction that there's some sort of conversation happening, that one person is presumably telling a story to another person who we might imagine could ask questions, get some clarification, that kind of thing. So there's, within the story, a madman and his audience. Then if we step back, there's another level of audience, and this would be the wider reading audience that Poe wanted this story to reach. And so this is his original intended audience. What Poe is trying to do is engage this audience, those people that he wanted to purchase or otherwise read his work, and he's drawing them in through the technique of the fictional audience of the story. The idea here is that the readers will be so intrigued by what seems to be the chance to listen in on the conversation of a crazy person with some unknown character who appears to be asking questions or giving responses to the madman's story. The idea is that this audience will be so engaged they'll want to keep reading. Then, of course, there are other levels of audience. For example, those of us who are reading the work of Edgar Allan Poe today, those of us who are studying him to try and understand his original intended audience, which could probably be defined as people living in 19th century America who like stories that have something of the Gothic or the horror about them. And someday, maybe a century from now, there will be another audience that not only studies Poe's writing, but also studies what we, people living in the 21st century, thought about Poe, how we discussed him, what we thought was important to his original audience. And who knows, in a decade or so, someone could be talking about how I am talking to you about how we understand Poe's audience. And as you're probably starting to imagine, this audience thing, this issue of multiple levels of audiences can go on and on forever. The best we can do as writers is try to clearly imagine our intended audience and then respect that audience by offering them the best writing we possibly can. Let's consider another piece of writing that both establishes a strong narrator's voice and constructs an audience. Here's the opening of the classic short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Now, this is the story, as probably some of you know, of a woman who's going mad. She and her family have rented a home in the country to try and find some sort of rest cure for what's ailing her. And the idea is that we, the reader, are looking over her shoulder at her diary. She writes about the time they spend in the house, and over time, as the diary progresses, we watch her descend into insanity as we're reading her words. Here's the opening of her story. It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. There comes John, and I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. So what do we make of this, particularly after our discussion of Poe's Black Cat? Well, again, we have a first-person speaker who engages the audience by creating the sense of a conversation. The main character is speaking in her own voice, talking directly to someone. In this case, it's her own diary. And we're drawn into the story by the fact that there's something fascinating about reading something that's meant to be private. In this case, the audience is drawn in further by the fact that we're witnessing a woman descending into madness while she herself seems completely unaware of this. The story gets weirder and weirder as it continues, with the main character describing how she sees a woman hiding in the pattern of the wallpaper of her room. In the narrator's words, this woman she sees, quote, creeps around the room at night. It's literally a creepy word that she chooses to convey this. So at the climax of the story, the narrator locks herself in the room with this dreadful yellow wallpaper on the walls, and then we read the following words. "Why, there's John at the door. It is no use, young man. You can't open it. How he does call and pound. Now he's crying to Jenny for an axe. It would be a shame to break down that beautiful door." How do you react to these lines? Well, this final line about how it's a shame to break down such a beautiful door helps secure audience reaction, and that clearly we can see that she's totally detached from reality, and she is completely lost it if her husband is trying to chop down the door, and she's not considering why he might do this, but only, oh, it would be so sad to destroy such a beautiful door. It drives home how altered her mental state is. But as good as this story is, it doesn't quite respect the audience as much as it should. And can you guess why? I'm sure a few of you have already figured this out. Anything here that strikes you as wrong or kind of a false note? Well, first of all, Charlotte Perkins Gilman has hit upon a clever strategy to engage the audience, and that, again, is creating the fiction or idea that we're reading the diary of a woman as she goes crazy. But once you've got that premise established, it's really a problem when we reach the climax of the story. The speaker's locked in her room and her husband is calling for an axe. Do we really think that the main character is pausing to write the sentences, "Why, there's John at the door," and "Now he's crying to Jenny for an axe"? What's happened here clearly is that we've gone from reading the main character's diary to reading her mind. And here we get the sense that the author was either maybe hoping we just wouldn't notice, or else she hoped that given the story's other strengths, and it has many, that we'd forgive her this one mistake. Either way, we as an audience might feel a little like the author wasn't offering us her full respect. There was something similar with the first version of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And in the first version of that text, which came out in England, the narrator, Ishmael, tells the story in the first person, but at the conclusion, he drowns. Now, many contemporary critics wanted to know, how was it possible for us to know this story if the person who's telling it doesn't survive? This kind of suspension of disbelief, or what we might call a sort of limited omniscient approach, is more acceptable today among most critics, but at the time when Melville's work appeared, it was considered a major flaw. It was so major, in fact, that Melville actually changed the ending in the American edition of Moby Dick so that Ishmael survived. Although perhaps he didn't properly anticipate audience reaction with the first version, his decision to actually change the outcome of his story demonstrates the power of an audience and the need to be attentive to them and their demands. Okay, so we've talked about respecting your audience, but we should also be aware of how our writing constructs an audience, how our tone, our word choice, our style all signal this piece of writing is intended for intellectuals, or for children, or for young adults, or specialists in archaeology, or people with a general interest in the Middle Ages. So by way of example, let's look at two more pieces of writing that convey the same pieces of information, but are really intended for vastly different audiences. And these two quotes both describe the victory of William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The factors that led to William's victory are multiple and range from the mundane to the fantastic. Events quotidian and epic, natural and artificial, converged with extraordinary moments of luck, coincidence, poor planning, and misfortune to produce a final conflict that seems as if it could have been lifted directly from the pages of Homer or Virgil. All right, let's stop for a moment and try to come up with some words to describe the intended audience for this passage. This piece of writing is a little bit long. The sentences have some subclauses. And there's a kind of style or diction that we might describe as maybe elevated, perhaps, something like that. The syntax, with their repetitive pairing of opposing ideas like quotidian and epic, natural and artificial. These sort of pairings demonstrate that the writer is really conscious about his or her ability to use language. And so the impression you get from this alone is that the writer is assuming that this is an audience that's accustomed to reading really stylized writing, and that maybe they even expect stylized writing. Another big clue, and probably set off, klaxon alarms for you as you're trying to figure out for whom is this intended, would be the choice of words like quotidian. And this is what we used to call, in my day, an SAT word. So vocab that you would need to know in order to do well on the verbal portion of the SAT. Quotidian, as most of you know, just means the same thing as everyday or not unusual, something like that. But the writer here chose a synonym for that idea that you usually find used for and by people who are writing for those who are highly educated and who are highly educated themselves. It's a way of sort of signaling the author's status, at least in his or her own mind, and then sort of the nature of the audience that he expects to read this. Another clue about the intended audience is the final line, which references the works of the classical poets Homer and Virgil. By making this reference and not bothering to explain who Homer is or who Virgil is, the writer signals that she or he expects the audience to be familiar with these poets and the epics they composed. So essentially, no explanation is necessary. It's kind of a shorthand way of identifying the intended audience. So now that we've worked through all that, how would you describe the intended audience for this passage? How does the tone, style, and word choice construct that audience, or the audience that the writer desires? Well, again, we can probably agree that the writer expects his or her readers to be highly educated, to know classical works, and the seriousness of the tone also suggests that the readers the author is expecting are people who are, at the very least, really dedicated amateur historians, and more likely, they may be scholars who are conducting research on the topic of William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings. In other words, we can all be pretty sure that this is not meant for an audience of sixth graders, nor I don't think we'd expect to find it at the beginning of an article that we might see in one of those magazines you see at the supermarket checkout stand. On the other hand, it could be something that would appear in what we might call a more serious publication like The New Yorker or Scientific American, but it might still be inaccessible or uninteresting to the general readership of those magazines. It reads more like the beginning of a scholarly chapter or article, the kind with lots of footnotes, which is another way of signaling who you think you are as an author and who you think your audience is. And we'll talk more about that later. All right, so that's the first example. Here's another example that conveys the same information in a really different way. William's conquest seemed unlikely at first, but a series of events ranging from bad weather to bad luck resulted in his surprising victory. The details of what happened make for a great story. It's one you'll never forget. Obviously, this second passage is written a little more simply, and it seems to be intended for a much more general audience. And this audience is maybe only slightly interested in the topic, or this audience is new to historical reading, and the author's approach, in contrast with the first passage, seems to be to try and draw people in, to intrigue them. You have the use of words like luck and surprising, and of course, the final phrase, it's a story you'll never forget. All of this is working together to try and get the reader interested and to keep that reader reading. And really, who doesn't like a good story? The author seems to be saying here that historical information can be entertaining if it's presented in the right way. By contrast, that first passage seems to take it as a given that the audience is already interested in the topic and doesn't need to be drawn in or encouraged to read further. The second example is more simply written with more accessible language, but at the same time, you get the sense that the author is not doing what we might call writing down to the audience. In In other words, making them feel less educated or informed than the writer is. This author is very skillfully writing to a clearly identified audience, and this seems to be imagined as the broad range of the population, anywhere from elementary school to adulthood, and clues that might exclude potential readers, like the references to Homer and Virgil, those are cut out so that no one who picks this up and starts to read is going to say, oh, this isn't for me. The second passage says to almost anyone who starts reading it, oh, this could be written for me. Let's now consider some examples of student essay writing that either miss their targeted audience, misjudge their targeted audience, or in a couple cases offend their targeted audience. And while I'm focusing here for the moment on college-level essays, what I'm discussing applies to any type of writing, from letters to the editor, to magazine articles, to short stories. So here's an actual passage from an actual student paper discussing a scene from Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. And as you may remember, this is a version of the story of King Arthur that was written in the late Middle Ages. And in this student paper, I came across the following passage. Quote, "Then comes the famous scene when Sir Lancelot gets shot in the butt by the lady huntress while he's sleeping. Now, I know even the best knight of the world needs to get some shut-eye now and then, but he's got no business going around sleeping with his rear end exposed like that." What's wrong with the way the writer imagines the audience of this essay? Probably most of you are thinking that the word "but," for starters, is rarely appropriate in any type of writing for any audience. And you would be right, although there must be a few exceptions. I can't think of any of them at the moment, but there must be one or two. In any event, remember, this is an essay for a college-level English class, so the use of slang like this is completely inappropriate. It might be appropriate in a conversation with your college roommate, but not in an essay that you're turning into your professor. Also, the tone comes across as a little too conversational for a college-level writing class. There should be some degree of formality, as presumably you're writing this paper for a scholar who is something of an expert in this field. The thing that gets me the most about this passage is that the student is basically right when he says Sir Lancelot has, quote, "no business going around sleeping with his rear end exposed." He doesn't. If you're familiar at all with the legend of King Arthur, then you know that Arthur's greatest knight is Lancelot, and the king depends upon him. And if a knight is injured in the buttock, then that means he won't be able to ride a horse, and thus he's really not a knight. And so the king is without the help of his greatest warrior. So the student has absolutely the right idea, but the execution is all wrong. The kind of chatty tone also suggests that the writer doesn't fully appreciate or respect the teacher-student relationship. He's writing to me as if we're friends who go out for pizza together, not as if I'm someone who is responsible for instructing him to prepare him for a career once he's out of school. One thing you should always remember when you're writing a piece that you're going to submit for consideration to anyone is always err on the side of caution. Use a more formal tone rather than one that suggests familiarity, and never assume that you're doing anyone a favor by giving them your brilliant writing for their consideration. You may hope that they feel that way after they read it, but don't assume that. Because this may very well be the most brilliant argument ever made about Sir Lancelot, or the most scintillating magazine article, or the most amazing short story the world has ever seen, and you want the world to get a chance to see it, so don't blow it with inappropriate tone that makes your audience feel like the writer doesn't respect them. So how could we improve this student passage while essentially keeping the main point intact? First, obviously, we've got to change the tone a little. So let's change the first line, the one that says, "Then comes the famous scene when Sir Lancelot gets shot in the butt by the lady huntress while he's sleeping." Let's change that to something like, "The scene in which the sleeping Sir Lancelot is injured by the lady huntress, while humorous, is also very important." Okay, that works much better. The second line, which memorably argued that Sir Lancelot had, quote, no business sleeping without his armor on, could be altered to say something like, although the character of Sir Lancelot has just been through an exhausting ordeal and needs to sleep, his decision to rest in the woods without his armor on is irresponsible. Any injury to his buttock means that he will no longer be able to act as a knight. This revised version says the same thing as the original, but the tone, the word choice, and structure of the sentences constructs and defines the intended audience as someone with a serious interest in this topic, and not your college roommate who has casually asked you to explain what's so important about a scene in a book you're reading for class. So let's think back and figure out what are the important things we learned in today's lecture. Well, first off, and I think the most important thing, is the idea that when you write, you construct not only an authorial or a writerly persona, you also construct an audience. It doesn't matter if you're writing a great American novel, or you're writing a letter to the editor, or a nonfiction magazine article, or you're writing in your diary. On some level, you have an idea of to whom you're writing. So in the lecture before this one, we talked about finding your voice. And today you could say we talked about the other side of that situation, and we addressed the need to understand your listener. Today we also learned about the different levels of audience. As the examples of Poe's The Black Cat and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper show, you can create a fictional idea of audience within whatever piece you're creating, and this can add to the interest and engagement of the actual audience. But I think if you only take one thing away from today's lecture, you really need to remember that we discussed how you always need to respect your audience. We talked about how Melville and Gilman, to some degree, didn't respect the intelligence of their audiences, or at least they seemed to hope that their audiences would give them a pass for inconsistencies in their writing. More serious was the case of the student essay writer, whose tone, word choice, and style all suggested that he was not taking the assignment he had been given very seriously. As the two examples of the paragraph about William the Conqueror showed, it's entirely possible to convey the same information to two very different audiences. In this case, one that's made up of specialists and scholars, and another that's made up of the general population who might not be all that interested in the topic to start with. In the exercises that accompany today's lecture, you'll be asked to convey the same basic pieces of information to some very different audiences. And this is a variation on the exercises from last time, when I asked you to convey the same pieces of information, but as if they were being written or described by very different kinds of writers or speakers. So now that we've spent 2 lectures talking about writerly identity and audience, we're going to turn our attention in the next lecture to mastering these skills as you construct an argument. In particular, we'll devote Lecture 6 to effective strategies for starting an argument, and we'll enhance our discussion with analysis of some of the greatest essays in the English and American literary traditions, namely Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal and Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. We'll analyze the opening of these arguments to see what makes them so effective, and then construct a toolkit to help you transfer these skills to your own writing.